Hey everyone, Alan Hoffman here, and this is my presentation on the rhetoric of disrupt text and why what we teach is important. So, first off, what is disrupt text? And this is taken directly from Disrupt Text website and their about page there. And it says Disrupt Text is a crowdsourced grassroots effort by teachers for teachers to challenge the traditional canon in order to create a more inclusive, representative, and equitable language arts curriculum that our students deserve. It is part of our mission to aid and develop teachers committed to anti-racist, anti-bias teaching pedagogy and practices. And at the bottom are the four founders of Disrupt Text. Basically, what Disrupt Text does is, as they say, challenge the canon, challenge what is usually taught in schools in order to make a more well-rounded English language education. And this really ties in a lot with how kind of NCTE is pushing through. For those of you that don't know, NCTE is the National Council of Teachers of English, and they have a couple of position papers that I utilized here too to kind of show us why disrupt text is kind of taking off now. So NCTE on diverse text, they resolved, and this was, I just believe, like last year, 2019, maybe 2018, that the National Council of Teachers of English advocate for more children's and young adult books from publishers and booksellers that reflect the culturally diverse lives and experiences present in the United States, and highlight and support authors, illustrators, publishers, and booksellers whose work represents multiple perspectives and cultural diversity in the lives of all children. Additionally, NCTE put out this statement on Indigenous peoples and people of color and encouraged schools in how they wanted to work with them. And that position paper reads in part that teachers and administrators should ask whether their English and language arts curricula include more than token representation of Indigenous or people of color writers and or critics. Number two, efforts are consistently made in the classroom to encourage active use of materials which have more than a token representation of Indigenous and people of color writers/critics. And efforts are consistently made to incorporate robust contextual materials that appropriately frame Indigenous and people of color's contributions. So there is this push from kind of the national advocacy group for English education to be more inclusive, be more diverse in the books that we teach and stuff like that. And we might be thinking, like, okay, well, sure, this checks out. What's kind of the big hangup? And the big hangup is the influence that the canon has on Western literature, and well, not I shouldn't say the canon has on Western literature, but the influence that the canon has on school curriculum. And so, despite those pushes for diversity that we see from NCT, and despite the disrupt text movement, which has really only been around since I think like 2017, 2018, the canon looms really large over school curriculum. The canon is exclusive, it's elite, it's the best of the best, or at least that's how it's brought out to be. And Harold Bloom, who I'll quote from in a little bit, really talks about that. The problem with the canon is that it's also very white, male, cis, and European in nature, and it's at the expense of diverse authors. This isn't to say that there isn't a little bit of diversity in the canon, but it more or less tilts to one side of things. And so here's some quotes from Harold Bloom on the canon, and this comes from the book that I had that picture of, On the Western Canon. He writes, the Western canon does not exist in order to augment pre-existing social elites. It is there to be read by you and by strangers, so that you and those you will never meet can encounter authentic aesthetic power. And the mind's dialogue with itself is not primarily a social reality. All the Western canon can bring one is the proper use of one's solitude. So basically in these, Bloom is saying, like, the canon is just a reading guide. It's a suggestion. It's fine. But he doesn't take into account that, what he puts into the canon using his influence as a literary critic has a lot of sway on how universities, what they want to teach in their literature courses, what high schools teach in their literature courses, how teacher prep courses are designed, when we talk about the teaching of reading and the teaching of literature and how do we do that, what are the best practices. Um, and Bloom is also really, I'm going to say, ignorant about the political and social movements that the canon has. He kind of seems to think like almost that like these are books. They don't have a social position. They don't have any political positions. And then he ends up saying some not great stuff about diversity. And as I was reading through kind of his opening bits on the Western canon, there were a couple of things that I just like, oh, this is kind of gross. He says, we are destroying all intellectual and aesthetic standards in the humanities and social sciences in the name of social justice. The Western canon, despite the limitless idealism of those who would open it up, exists precisely in order to impose limits, to set a standard of measurement that is anything but political or moral. And I don't know how you can say that it's not a political act to say that this book is better than another one. And I don't know how you can look at your list, and he has 26 authors on the Western canon, and go, okay, overwhelmingly these are white males, most of them are European, and that is being put at the expense of other people. How is that not political? Um, a lot of kind of the rhetoric that Bloom uses is very almost tribal. He's very defensive of the canon, um, but almost tribal, almost very protective of it. Almost the word I'm looking for a specific word, but I can't think of it right now. And then he just sort of keeps going along those lines. He says, we are losing now and doubtless will go on losing, and there is a sorrow in that, because many of the best students will abandon us for other disciplines and professions. They are justified in doing so because we could not protect them against our profession's loss of intellectual and aesthetic standards of accomplishment and value. All that we can do now is maintain some continuity with the aesthetic and not yield to the lie that what we oppose is adventure and new interpretations. I should note that, at least in his introduction, Bloom does not mention what authors or genres or works in particular that people are advocating for that he says no to. But in our current context, we can read his words and go, you know, when you're talking about opening this up to more African American or people of color as authors, works that have, you know, they talk about different genres, for instance, and things that kind of challenge those ideas. The canon, Bloom takes a very political stance and says no. And again, there's that protection, there's that tribalism, there's an ideology behind the canon, but it's kind of disguised as it's not an ideology. Just this, it's almost like this is the way it is. How can you possibly go about this? I'm only saying that these books are beautiful. What could possibly be the problem? Well, the problem is that the canon is not just a reading guide. It influences curriculum and influences the college board. The college board is who puts out the advanced placement exams and stuff like that. And I had the honor, I'm going to say, of teaching an AP literature class last year. And this question 3 is something that gives kids a lot of trouble. And even when I went to an AP Summer Institute and sat in with a lot of English teachers from across the state of Montana, we talked about question 3, we had a really heated debate about what question 3 is talking about when they say, select a work of literary merit. So question 3 says, it's basically says like, here is a theme that you see in literature a lot, or here's a literary device that we see. Pick any work that you want. Here are some suggestions, but pick any work that you want and analyze it, but it has to be of literary merit. But they don't really talk about what that means, and that's way open for interpretation. Probably what literary merit means is the canon, things like that. There was a student at that AP Summer Institute that I was at that he was talking about, and he was also a reader. He had served as a reader that year on question 3. He said, these were the things that I struck. I said right away, they don't meet literary merit. And he talked about like Harry Potter, which, okay, I can see that. That's young adult, and maybe for AP kids you want some. But he was also talking about Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick, Lord of the Rings by J.R. Tolkien, which are foundational texts in science fiction and fantasy that have a lot of, I would argue, literary merit. It's very subjective, but when it's other people that are making that determination and it's being led primarily by Bloom and all these white literary critics, it has some difficulties. So as I was going through this project, I really thought about why I teach what I teach. And so part of that is that, sorry, I just got a phone call, my bad. I thought about why I teach what I teach because I value diversity. Um, the diverse text movement or the disrupt text movement is something that I really buy into, I really like. But I looked at what I teach and I don't follow that. And I was saying, so why is it that I don't do that? And I think it's mostly because the canon is what I know. Um, the canon is what I was taught in high school. Um, it's what's taught a lot, even in our literature classes. And it's what I know. It's what and that's how I fell in love with books and words. Like, I enjoyed, Animal Farm is in the stack of books on here. And so, and that's one of the first books that I fell in love with. I know it's a weird one to love, but I do. I love Animal Farm. And I mean, I will give it this to Bloom. Those books are beautiful. Like, there is aesthetic power into them. The other thing is the canon is easy. When I was looking at teaching a play to my junior high class last year, I ended up going with Shakespeare because I knew administration was going to sign off on it. I know I could find resources. It was accessible for me, at least. It was kind of a safe choice. And for me, being in Savage, the canon represents most of my students. Most of my students are white. They are privileged. They might not think about it, but most of them are. They identify as straight. They identify as Christian. The canon represents them. When we talk about seeing yourself in literature, the canon is full of characters that they can relate to. It might be harder for them to relate to a star from The Hate You Give, for instance. But I don't know that that's a reason to not teach it. But that's why I teach what I teach. So I got on this whole thing because I came across this tweet called hashtag defend the canon. And while it doesn't talk about disrupt text, it's kind of in response to that. And this teacher, who I follow on Twitter, says, not going to lie, I thought of this tweet when I rotated the Scarlet Letter back into the curriculum this year, hashtag defend the canon. And it's a picture of another teacher's tweet saying, here are a few of the books we read, discuss, and celebrate in our classroom, not pictured the Scarlet Letter or any of the classics. And it has in there The Hate You Give, I'm Not Your Perfect Mexican Daughter, I think Dear Martin is in there, things like that. And so a lot of diverse book selection and stuff like that. And so this teacher, Matt Ryan, he loves teaching the canon, which is fine. But he also says kind of some tone deaf things, sort of like what Harold Bloom does. So that kind of guy is what got me thinking about that, because it's like, I kind of want to teach books like these, and I don't mind the Scarlet Letter, but sometimes that doesn't resonate with my kids. And can I get across what I want to teach with maybe some more diverse texts and challenge them and make them a little bit more uncomfortable? So building off of his tweet, I was kind of curious about what does the canon do to marginalized groups? And for that, I looked at Cheryl Glenn's Unspoken, Rhetoric of Silence. And she said some really interesting things about the power dynamics that go on for marginalized groups. She says, silence is expected and therefore goes unnoticed from people who wield power. Silence also goes unnoticed, or if noticed, then appreciated in those whose words are not valued, which makes for a communal silence. And so in those two quotes, what she's saying is, when you have a Harold Bloom or a Matt Ryan, for instance, they just sort of expect these diverse texts to just not say anything because they wield power. They're the ones in control. The canon represents them, and they expect these voices to kind of go away. And then it also goes to notice in those whose words are not valued. They don't think about those words. They don't think about Angie Thomas or Maya Angelou or Sherman Alexie, because in their discourse, those words aren't valued. Glenn also says the dominant group in a social hierarchy renders inarticulate or muted groups any of the traditionally disenfranchised and excludes them from the formulation, validation, and circulation of meaning. And kind of that quote really spoke to me about what the canon does, because the canon is decided by literary critics. And who are literary critics? For the most part, white dudes. And these groups that are writing and they're putting out work that should be valued, it excludes them from the formulation, validation, and circulation of meaning. Their stories fall on deaf ears, and because they fall on deaf ears, because they are silenced, they don't get the chance to have that meaning. This also, by the way, refers to not just people of color or women, but it could also refer to young people who are traditionally silenced. And young adult literature, which is written for them, is a lot of times criticized or not valued in literary circles as not having literary merit, and what can you possibly learn from it. But if you talk to students, those are the books that they get excited about. And as an educator, I'm more interested in them getting excited about a book and talking about a book and being able to analyze something that they find accessible than trying to shove some kind of dry book that they don't really connect with down their throats because it's aesthetically pleasing. The book, not shoving it down their throats. So like I said, if diverse authors are not a part of a curriculum, their stories cannot have an impact. They are silenced. Their meaning is lost. Yeah, the words are still there, but if they're not brought to that audience, and if we don't value the bringing of that to them as educators or administrators or school boards, then the power of those words is kind of lost. And in its place, we get this kind of narrow mindset of what is deemed good. And again, not that the books in the canon are bad, but there's so much more out there that only teaching the canon limits us. I also think, in turn, this silences our students' ability to connect with and understand people who are unlike themselves, which I think is one of the biggest points of literature, is that you connect with people that you don't know, you understand their stories. We use stories as a way to connect. And if we silence those stories, then we also silence our students' ability to resonate with people that are unlike them. I also read a little bit from Bell Hooks, Talking Back, Thinking Feminist, Thinking Black. And I really liked this quote that she had. When Black female poet and lesbian activist Audre Lorde shared with the world the poem A Litany for Survival, she addressed the issue of silence, urging all females, and especially Black females, to break silences by speaking out, by telling our stories. Lorde told exploited and oppressed females in the poem that silence will not save us, declaring that moving past fear to speak is a necessary gesture of resistance. And this talks about the power of words, the power of speech, the power of writing, the power of speaking what you know into existence. What I also like, though, about this is it kind of gets into what I think Disrupt Text does, and it's kind of an invitational rhetoric of come, tell your story, and also come, listen to what we have to say. Yes, there is a little bit of, when we get into more of what Disrupt Text says, a little bit of combativeness, but a lot of it is inviting teachers along and saying, hey, we need you to do this. We need you to feel comfortable doing this. We need you to give us a space for these exploited and oppressed peoples to tell their story. We have to have that space for them to move past their fear and to speak. And part of that space is our English classrooms. So we must not only allow everyone to speak, but we also must listen. What we put into our curriculum can influence which voices our students get to hear. And if they only hear Hemingway and Steinbeck and Shakespeare, as much as I love those three authors, we're silencing our students and their ability to empathize with other people just as much as we're silencing the authors and the works that we think might enrich our students' lives. On the one hand, it is important for our students to see themselves in literature, but they must also see others and connect with them. That's how we build empathy, and that's how we build a better world, I think. So the following slides come from the Disrupt Text website, and they disrupted. They had slow chats on Twitter, um, referring to special authors or works and stuff like that. And so I wanted to just kind of showcase some of those things. And I said it invites and it pushes. Disrupt Text invites us, it uses that invitational rhetoric of come on, join us, do this together, but it also pushes and says like, hey, the canon isn't everything. We need to challenge the way that we think. It invites you to kind of join the revolution almost. So on the Crucible, they say educators in the chat discussed using the Crucible as a way to open up conversations about prison and bail reform, ways to interrogate systems of power and privilege that marginalize peoples of color and many others from minoritized populations. So in this case, they say, like, yeah, you can still teach the Crucible. They don't have a problem with you teaching the Crucible. But they said, maybe you look at it at not just the lens of McCarthyism, like it's typically taught, but you also look at current issues that are affecting people today using it. On Shakespeare, um, it's a little bit more combative, as we'll see. Um, and this is a recap of the chat, and they write, many teachers explain that he and his plays are universal and that one cannot go a day without seeing a reference to Shakespeare in popular culture. People can also argue that one cannot go a day without seeing biblical references in our popular culture. In fact, Shakespeare makes biblical references, and yet we don't teach the Bible every year. English classes, generally speaking, don't require the Bible as one of the texts in its course curriculum. So let us be honest, the conversation really isn't about universality, nor, and this isn't about being equipped to identify all possible cultural references. This is about an ingrained and internalized elevation of Shakespeare in a way that excludes other voices. This is about white supremacy and colonization. And I write about this in my paper. They have lists of other plays that you could teach. And I was like, I don't know who these authors are. I've never heard of these plays. And that goes back to the accessibility. Like, I know with a Shakespeare play, I know what I'm going to get. I know I have like the standards that I can rely on to teach pretty reliably. I can teach Hamlet and Macbeth and Midsummer Night's Dream and Romeo and Juliet and Julius Caesar and know what I'm going to get, and it's fine. These other ones, they require research, they require other knowledge that maybe I don't have. But part of this is also making myself uncomfortable so I can provide something that enriches my students. They also disrupted genre, and I thought this one was really fascinating too. They write, another idea that surfaced during our chat was the issue of young adult novels and how so many teachers dismiss it due to beliefs that it lacks rigor and seriousness and validate in their literary merit. As we discussed, that only reveals that teachers' own lack of understanding of YA literature and their lack of ability to dig deep into critical texts. This literature is written for young people and discussing topics they are concerned with. Often YA surfaces issues of race, ethnicity, culture, gender, and sexuality that classical texts don't address. And often when they do address it, because they're a product of their time, they're highly problematic. And so a common thing is people say, okay, look at these issues that young adult or these disrupt text suggestions deal with. I can find something in Shakespeare and I can tie that in. Or To Kill a Mockingbird deals with racism, and I'll talk about To Kill a Mockingbird here in a little bit. What Disrupt Text is saying is there's stuff that your students will find more accessible, that's more diverse, that's more current, that you can use. And by expanding our definition of what we want to give to our kids and saying we can use graphic novels and we can use young adult novels, maybe we reach more students and we make a better English curriculum. So this one was a really interesting read. It was on To Kill a Mockingbird. And I don't know if you know, but there's kind of To Kill a Mockingbird in the last couple of years has become a fairly controversial book amongst English teachers. And kind of this quote kind of sums up that debate. This book is loved by so many white Americans. It's so popular. So many have a deep relationship to it, and it lives in a general cloud of nostalgia in schools. Challenging the teaching of it strikes some deep emotional chords for them. This disruption of its position on the pedestal is perceived as a threat to many because it forces them to have to reconsider their own moral compass as well as question their own teaching approach. That shouldn't stop this work. We are not called to teach texts we love, but to teach skills so our students can be critical thinkers. If we are skilled teachers, we can do that with any text. There are better texts. And I think what's really interesting about this quote that I pulled up, it's in a lot of ways invitational, and it's very almost sympathetic towards people that would defend To Kill a Mockingbird. And I teach To Kill a Mockingbird, and I love teaching it. And they kind of empathize with it. So many people have that deep relationship with it. There's nostalgia for them. But at the same time, it says, you know, you're going to have to be uncomfortable. You're going to have to really think about the messages that this book sends. And there are some problematic messages in To Kill a Mockingbird, which I won't get into now, but if you have questions, please ask and I'll talk about them. So again, it invites and it pushes. So kind of to wrap things up near the end, because, and I spoke to this earlier in a class meeting about my feelings as a white guy, doing some research and talking about this, and kind of my discomfort about that, and wanting to honor it and not, it's messy. But this was an article I found. It was in the English Journal by Daniel O'Grady, who's a white teacher. And he wrote, at the NCTE annual convention in Houston, 3 of the 4 co-founders of DisruptText, Tricia Ebervia, Lerna Germain, and Julia Torres, took the stage and urged the audience to disrupt the traditional Western literary canon in schools. Ebervia's closing remarks rocked my soul. Step up and speak out, Ebervia told the standing room crowd, challenging us to dismantle systems of oppression and white supremacy in schools and literary studies. White men, we need you. You have power. Use it, Ebervia exclaimed. So again, inviting everyone to buy into this, to disrupt literature teaching, to disrupt what we do. And I read that and I was like, I felt a lot better about it. I don't know. And in case you're wondering, yes, I do plan on disrupting text. I do plan on ordering some classroom sets of novels for the next school year. I'm not going to totally revamp things, but I want to slide some stuff in that that gives a more diverse representation of the literature that we teach to my students. So yes, this impact did have some stuff for me. It did impact me. So some final thoughts and recommendations. Only by disrupting my own teaching can I get the diversity that I seek, and that's what I plan on doing. I also think that good literature should make us feel uncomfortable. This is how we learn, how we grow, how we become better. And even going back to Kill a Mockingbird, there's a lot of people that say that book makes them uncomfortable because there's racism in it, and that's the point of the book. But as DisruptText says, there's better, more contemporary texts that deal with that and can make it more accessible to your kids. So maybe we need to use that. As a teacher, it's my responsibility to introduce these concepts to my students. And like they said, it's not my responsibility to teach them books that I love, even though I really love teaching books that I love, but it's my responsibility to teach them things that will help them. However, as much as DisruptText resonates with me, and it resonates, I think, with a lot of English teachers, I can't do it alone. Administrators and school boards must also join this movement and be okay with it, especially in really white areas of the country. I also think that teacher prep courses need to do their part. We need to talk about disrupting the literary canon in our English ed department and talk about how you can introduce diverse texts, even if you're teaching in a place that lacks diversity itself. So I don't think this is something that's going to be fixed by an individual teacher or a group of teachers, but it's going to have to be kind of a systematic thing, which in a way makes it sort of a simile or metaphor for our problems with racism as a society. So anyway, that is my presentation on DisruptText, the rhetoric of it, and kind of the research that I found. I hope you found this to be entertaining, and I'll answer any questions that you have in class.